The air in the Cathedral of Sens did not circulate, it lingered, heavy with the scent of unwashed wool, cold stone, and the cloying sweetness of expensive beeswax. It was a scent that spoke of permanence, the kind that outlasts the flesh. In the center of this cavernous silence stood a child. She was 7 years old, a slip of a girl named Isabelle, whose bones felt as fragile as the glass in the clerestory windows. Opposite her stood a man of 33 winters, a king whose beard was a thicket of iron gray and whose eyes held the weary predatoriness of a sovereign who had already buried one world and was busy inventing another. Time, in the Middle Ages, was not a river, it was a wheel. But for Isabelle, on this morning of leaden skies, the wheel had jammed. To be 7 is to exist in the eternal present of play and the soft touch of a mother's linen sleeve. To be a queen consort at 7 is to be forcibly ejected from the garden of innocence into the cold, geometric reality of statecraft. The crown they placed upon her brow was padded with velvet to keep it from slipping over her ears, yet its physical weight was nothing compared to the metaphysical burden it signaled. In the medieval mind, the body of the queen was not her own, it was a fiefdom, a territory to be surveyed, tilled, and eventually harvested for heirs. As the bishop's voice droned in a Latin that sounded like the grinding of millstones, Isabelle watched a single fly buzz against a sunbeam. She envied the fly. It possessed a frantic, buzzing freedom that she had just exchanged for a throne of gilded thorns. The king, her husband, did not look at her with lust, that would come later, a terrifying prospect whispered by ladies-in-waiting in the dark corners of the nursery. Instead, he looked at her with the cold calculation of a merchant inspecting a seal on a contract. To him, she was not a child, she was the County of Artois. She was a strategic alliance against the encroaching shadow of the Plantagenets. She was a biological promise. We often speak of freedom as the ability to move, but in the 12th century, freedom was the luxury of the nameless. The higher one climbed the social ladder, the tighter the stays of duty became. The peasant might starve, but he belonged to his hunger. The queen belonged to the realm. Isabelle's isolation began the moment the ring, too large for her finger, bound with silk thread to stay in place, was slid onto her hand. It was a golden shackle. She was now a prisoner of her own bloodline. What is a soul when it is traded for a border fortification? What is a childhood when it is compressed into a political gesture? The banquet that followed was a blur of grease and noise. The smell of roasted boar, heavy with sage and vinegar, made her stomach churn. The music of the lutes was sharp, discordant to her ears, which longed for the quiet lullabies of her wet nurse. She sat on a high dais, her feet dangling inches above the rush-covered floor. Below her, the court celebrated a union that was, in truth, a funeral for her girlhood. She noticed the way the candlelight flickered against the tapestries, making the woven hound seem to snap at the heels of the woven deer. Everything in this world was chasing or being chased. There was the rhythmic clinking of chainmail as the king's guards shifted their weight, a reminder that power is always chaperoned by violence. There was the rough texture of the Hainault embroidery on her gown, a reminder of a home she would never truly see again as a private person. And there were her husband's hands, large, scarred, and stained with the ink of decrees, resting near her own small, pale palms. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long, bruised shadows across the stone floor, the reality of her isolation took root. She was surrounded by thousands, yet she was utterly alone. Her mother was gone, sent back to a distant court. Her playmates were replaced by grim-faced governesses whose task was to prepare her for a destiny she could not yet name. Faith, in this era, offered a cold comfort. They told her she was blessed, like the Virgin Mary, chosen for a divine purpose. But Isabelle, looking at the looming silhouette of the king, felt only the crushing weight of the secular world. If God was a father, he was a stern one who demanded her disappearance into the role of a vessel. Death was not a distant specter in the Middle Ages, it walked the halls. It sat at the table. For a child queen, death was the shadow of the birthing bed that awaited her in a few years' time. But there is a smaller, quieter death that happens first, the death of the self. As the bells of the cathedral rang for vespers, Marking the end of her first day as a wife, Isabelle realized that the girl who had played with wooden dolls that morning was gone. In her place sat a small, shivering icon of a kingdom's ambition. The silence of the stone walls began to swallow her, and the long wait for her own maturation began, a countdown conducted in the cold, hallowed dark of a palace that felt more like a reliquary than a home. The years that followed the wedding were a slow, rhythmic haunting. Isabelle did not grow up in the palace, she was curated, like a holy relic being prepared for a feast day. Her life was measured by the height of the sun against the cold limestone of the Louvre's towers and the terrifying, silent arrival of her own blood. She lived in a gilded limbo, a space between the nursery and the marriage bed that felt like a long, breathless hallway. The king, her husband, was a ghost who appeared at high feasts, a mountain of fur and iron who smelled of damp horses and old parchment. To him, she was a crop slowly ripening in a field he had already bought, he was simply waiting for the harvest. Isabelle spent her days in the company of women whose faces were etched with the fatigue of survival. They taught her to embroider, to pray, and to remain silent. The silence was a physical thing, thick as the dust motes dancing in the shafts of light that pierced the narrow windows. She learned that for a woman of her station, speech was a risk, and thought was a sanctuary. She often sat by the window, watching the Seine churn with gray, winter silt, thinking about the nature of time. To the church, time belonged to God. To the king, it belonged to history. To Isabelle, time was a thief that was slowly stealing the child and replacing her with a queen, a transformation she watched with a detached, quiet horror. She felt the isolation in the way the servants touched her, always with a reverent distance, as if they were handling a glass chalice that might shatter and cut them. No one hugged her. No one ruffled her hair. Even her prayers felt like petitions to a distant, bureaucratic heaven where the saints were as busy and indifferent as the royal chancellors. She would kneel on the cold flags of the chapel, the stone sapping the heat from her knees, and wonder if the Virgin Mary had felt this same hollowness. Was the blessing of being chosen merely a polite word for being used? The candles would flicker and hiss, the smell of melting tallow mixing with the scent of her own fear, a sharp, metallic tang that she couldn't wash away. As she reached her 11th and 12th years, the atmosphere in the court shifted. The air grew heavy with a new kind of expectation. The king's visits became more frequent, his gaze lingering longer on the curve of her jaw and the widening of her hips. The talk of the court turned to the succession, a word that sounded like a bell tolling for her. She realized then that her body was not a private vessel of her soul, but a public utility. Her womb was the most important piece of land in the kingdom, and the pressure to produce a male heir began to crush her spirit before the physical act ever took place. The fear was not of the king himself, but of the void he represented. He was a man who lived for the future, for a dynasty that would outlast his own breath, and in that grand vision, Isabelle was merely a temporary bridge. She began to dream of falling through the stone floors, falling through the gray sky, falling away from the name they had given her. In those dreams, she was weightless and nameless, free from the golden threads that bound her to the throne. But every morning, the bells would wake her, and the maids would bring the heavy wool and silk to dress her, pinning her back into her identity with cold, silver needles. One evening, while walking in the small, enclosed garden of the palace, she found a bird that had flown into a stone wall and broken its wing. It lay on the damp earth, its chest heaving, its eyes bright with a frantic, useless terror. Isabelle picked it up, feeling the frantic heartbeat against her palm, a mirror of her own. She looked at the high walls, the guards on the battlements, and the looming shadow of the cathedral. She realized that she and the bird were the same, creatures caught in a geometry of power they could not understand and could never escape. She held the bird until it went still, feeling the warmth leave its tiny body, and for the first time, she felt a strange envy for the dead. To be dead was to be finished, to be a queen was to be perpetually becoming something for someone else. The transition from child to woman was not a gradual blossoming, it was a cold, administrative fact. When Isabelle turned 14, the priests and the physicians nodded in agreement. The truce between her girlhood and her duty had expired. The wedding night, delayed for 7 years, arrived with the sound of heavy iron keys turning in the locks of the royal apartments. The air in the chamber was thick with the scent of lavender and the acrid smoke of snuffed torches. The king did not speak much. He was a man of iron and earth, and his approach to the marriage bed was much like his approach to a siege, methodical, grim, and driven by a desperate need for a victory that would endure after his death. In the silence of that room, Isabelle felt the absolute erasure of her own will. The church spoke of the marital debt, a phrase that suggested she owed the very blood in her veins to the crown. As the heavy velvet curtains of the bed were drawn, shutting out the world, she looked up at the carved oak canopy and tried to imagine herself as stone. If she could be stone, she would not feel the weight of the man. If she could be stone, she would not feel the intrusion of a life that was not her own. She realized then that the soul does not leave the body all at once, it retreats, inch by inch, into the marrow of the bones, leaving the skin to endure what it must. The months that followed were a long, agonizing surveillance of her own body. Every morning, the court looked at her with a singular, predatory question in their eyes: is there life within? Her value was no longer measured by her lineage or her grace, but by the state of her womb. She became a spectator to her own anatomy, waiting for the missed cycle that would signify she had fulfilled her biological contract. Faith became a bartering tool. She prayed not for salvation, but for a son, knowing that her survival depended on her ability to produce a male heir. If she failed, she was nothing but a broken tool, a political mistake that could be discarded or annulled. The pressure began to manifest as a physical ache in her chest. She watched other women in the court, the laundresses, the bakers' wives, carrying their children with a casual, messy affection that she was forbidden to know. To her, a child would not be a person, it would be a shield. If she bore a king, she became the mother of France. If she remained barren, she was a ghost waiting for the exit. This realization brought a profound sense of the fragility of human existence. We build cathedrals of stone and empires of law, yet the entire edifice of a kingdom can rest on the precarious health of a single teenage girl. She found herself walking the battlements late at night, when the wind from the river was cold enough to make her eyes water. She looked at the stars and thought about the vast, indifferent silence of the universe. The stars did not care for the Cape Town line, the moon did not wax or wane for the sake of a French air. In those moments of cosmic isolation, she felt a strange, bitter sense of freedom. If the world was truly as large and as cold as it seemed, then her suffering was small. It was a drop of ink in a dark ocean. There was a peace in that insignificance, a quiet corner of the mind where the king and his demands could not reach. But the morning always returned, bringing with it the smell of porridge and the whispered rumors of the court. The king's patience was thinning like an old cloak. He was aging, his joints stiffening with the damp of the northern winters, and his obsession with an heir grew into a dark, suffocating cloud. He began to look at her with a growing resentment, as if her youth were a personal insult to his mortality. Isabelle realized that in the eyes of power, she was not a victim of circumstance, but a culprit of nature. The isolation of the throne was complete. She was a queen to the people, a vessel to the king, and a stranger to herself. The silence of the palace eventually turned into a weapon. By the time Isabelle reached her 15th year, the whispers in the corridors had crystallized into a cold, sharp plan. She was barren, or so the bishops and the king's advisors claimed. In the medieval world, the failure of the womb was never the fault of the soil, only the seed's inability to take root. The king, now nearing 40 and feeling the breath of the grave upon his neck, began to discuss the unthinkable, an annulment. To be discarded by a king was to be erased from the world. It meant being sent back to Hainault as a shamed woman, a political failure, or worse, being locked away in a convent where the stone walls would become her final shroud. The king's resentment manifested in a chilling emotional distance. He no longer visited her apartments, he no longer looked at her during the midday meal. She was a ghost walking through the halls of her own life. Isabelle felt the isolation like a physical frost. She spent her nights staring at the crucifix on her wall, wondering about the nature of a god who demanded so much from a girl and gave back only the hollow echo of a cathedral's nave. Is faith merely the endurance of cruelty? Or is it the ability to find a small, flickering light within the soul when all external lanterns have been extinguished? She realized that time was not her friend, it was a slow-moving blade, shaving away her relevance with every passing month that her belly remained flat. The threat of being sent away brought a strange, dark clarity to her mind. If she was to be discarded, she would at least be free of the weight of the crown. But the cost was her dignity and the safety of her family's alliance. The court became a theater of predators. Those who had once bowed low now looked past her, searching for the face of the next girl who would take her place in the king's bed. The smells of the palace, the roasting meats, the expensive oils, the fresh rushes, now felt like the scents of a funeral pyre. She was being prepared for a social death, a quiet exit into the fog of history where no one would remember her name. In a desperate bid for survival, Isabelle did something that few queens dared. She took to the streets. Not as a sovereign, but as a penitent. Clad in a simple woolen shift, barefoot on the frozen mud of the Paris streets, she walked to the churches of the poor. She sought the prayers of the commoners, the ones whose lives were short and brutal, hoping their raw, unrefined faith might reach a corner of heaven that the bishop's Latin could not. The cold bit into her skin, the sharp stones cut her feet, and for the first time, she felt a connection to the world. The pain was real. It was hers. It was not a political requirement, it was a human sensation. The people of Paris watched her with a mixture of awe and pity. They saw a girl queen, barely more than a child, humbled by the same biological cruelty that plagued their own wives and daughters. In this shared suffering, Isabelle found a trace of the freedom she had dreamed of. She was no longer a vessel of the state, she was a woman pleading with the universe for the right to exist. The isolation of the throne was momentarily broken by the gaze of a beggar woman who reached out to touch the hem of her cloak, not for a blessing, but in a gesture of silent, sisterly recognition. Despite her penance, the king's council moved forward with the divorce. They gathered in the great hall, a sea of black robes and stern faces, ready to strike her name from the records. Isabelle sat before them, feeling the weight of centuries of patriarchal law. She looked at her husband, the man who had bought her at 7 and was now selling her at 15, and she saw not a king, but a frightened man trying to outrun his own mortality. She realized that power is often just a mask for fear. In that moment of supreme vulnerability, as she stood on the precipice of being forgotten, a sudden, sharp nausea gripped her. It was a sensation she had prayed for, yet it felt like a final irony. The body, it seemed, had its own timing, indifferent to the decrees of men or the desperate pleas of a girl in the mud. The nausea was not a sickness, it was a revolution. When the physicians finally confirmed the presence of a quickening life, the machinery of the divorce ground to a sudden, screeching halt. The black-robed counselors vanished into the shadows, and the king, who had looked upon Isabelle with the coldness of a winter sea, suddenly returned with gifts of gold and silk. But the shift in his demeanor brought no warmth to Isabelle's heart. She saw the truth now, his love was a currency, paid only when the goods were delivered. She was no longer a discarded girl, but she was still not a human being. She was a sacred vault, containing the future of the Caption line. This new isolation was even more profound than the neglect. She was placed under a constant, suffocating watch. Every morsel of food was tasted for poison, every step she took was shadowed by guards and midwives. She was forbidden from the battlements, forbidden from the gardens, and forbidden from the simple woolen shift she had worn in the streets. They dressed her in heavy brocades that strained against her growing belly, pinning her down like a butterfly in a display case. The palace became a silent, opulent prison where the only sound was the ticking of a clock she could not see, the countdown to the birth. Philosophy tells us that freedom is the ability to choose one's own burden, but Isabelle had no choice. She was carrying a king, or a disappointment. There was no middle ground. She spent her days sitting in a chair by the hearth, watching the embers die, thinking about the nature of the soul that was growing inside her. Would this child be a person, or merely another link in the chain that bound her? She felt a strange, detached compassion for the life within. It was as much a prisoner as she was, destined to inherit a crown that would eventually crush its spirit, just as it had crushed hers. The smell of the chamber became an enemy, the scent of medicinal herbs, the heavy musk of the king's frequent, hovering presence, and the metallic tang of the silver basins they kept ready. She felt the weight of time as a physical pressure against her spine. In the medieval mind, the womb was a dark, mysterious forest where God worked his silent miracles, but to Isabelle, it felt like a battlefield. She was the terrain, and the survival of the kingdom was the stakes. She realized that her body was the only place where she could never be alone, yet her mind had never been more solitary. She began to lose the sense of where she ended and the role began. Was she Isabelle of Hainault, the girl who once dreamed of the open fields of her father's lands? Or was she merely the queen mother-to-be, a biological function dressed in velvet? She would touch her own face in the mirror, tracing the lines of exhaustion around her eyes, and feel a sense of mourning for the girl who had disappeared at 7 years old. The child she carried was a miracle to the kingdom, but to her, it was the final seal on her fate. As the 9th month approached, the heat of the summer settled over Paris like a damp shroud. The air was thick with the stench of the river and the buzzing of flies. Isabelle sat in the darkened room, listening to the distant chants of the monks praying for a male heir. She realized then that death and life were two sides of the same coin, tossed by a hand that did not care where it landed. She was prepared for the pain, for the blood, and for the possibility of the end. In the quiet, stifling dark, she made a silent pact with the universe. If she were to survive, she would find a way to keep a small part of herself hidden, a secret garden where the king's shadow could never fall. The labor began under a blood-red moon, a night when the stone of the palace seemed to sweat with the humid heat of a dying August. The chamber was no longer a room, it was a theater of agony, crowded with bishops, midwives, and the king's silent, watching shadow behind a screen. To the world, this was the arrival of a dynasty. To Isabelle, it was a slow, systematic tearing of her soul from her flesh. The smell of vinegar and hot iron filled the air, mingling with the heavy scent of incense burned to ward off the demons that haunt the birthing bed. The pain was a white-hot geography that she had to navigate alone. Each contraction was a wave of the sea, pulling her further away from the shore of the living. She realized, in the midst of the screams she did not recognize as her own, that the king was not waiting for her, he was waiting for the cargo she carried. If she were to perish and the child to live, the bells would still ring for joy. This was the ultimate loneliness of the medieval queen, to be the most precious vessel in the realm and the most expendable person in the room. When the cry of the infant finally pierced the heavy air, it was the sound of a miracle and a sentence. It was a boy. The future Louis VIII. The king wept, the monks sang, and the city of Paris erupted in a roar of bells that shook the very foundations of the Louvre. But in the center of the storm, Isabelle lay in a pool of her own spent youth, her face as pale as the altar cloth. She had delivered the kingdom, but she had lost the last thread of the girl she used to be. The child was taken from her almost immediately, swaddled in silk and handed to governors, for a king's son belongs to the state, not to a mother's arms. The years that followed were a hollow victory. She had secured her place, she was the queen mother, the untouchable icon of the Capetian line. But the fire in her eyes had been replaced by a quiet, crystalline frost. She watched her son grow from a distance, a small stranger being molded into a weapon of war and law. She saw the same cycle beginning again, the same isolation, the same weight of the crown, the same erasure of the self in the name of the holy blood. Isabelle died young, as many of these forgotten queens did, her body exhausted by the demands of a crown she never asked for. On her final day, the room was quiet. The king was away at the borders, and the palace was hushed in anticipation of the end. She looked at her hands, the hands that had once held a broken bird, the hands that had been bound with silk thread to a wedding ring at 7 years old. She realized that her life had been a long, slow sacrifice at an altar she did not believe in. The conclusion was bitter, yet it possessed a terrible beauty. She had been a ghost in her own life, a footnote in the chronicles of men, a bridge between two kings. But as the light faded from her eyes, she felt a sudden, profound lightness. The weight of the crown, the pressure of the womb, the cold gaze of the king, it all fell away. In the end, she belonged to no realm and no man. She returned to the silence of the stars, leaving behind a kingdom that would remember her name only in the fine print of a genealogy, never knowing the girl who had stood in the mud of Paris, seeking a god who had long ago turned his face away from the thrones of men. She was finally, irrevocably, free.
Like and subscribe to this channel for more interesting stories.